Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining in. Well, here's the question. Are shoppers still valuing sustainability in the midst of the economic downturn? People's commitment to reducing the environmental impact of their lives sends a strong message to companies that their products and services need to change. Over the past year, we've had members of the EPAM Continuum team on the show to discuss their Consumers Unmasked project. It's a 4-part study of shoppers' values and the important factors in their buying decisions as the pandemic peaked and then began to pass. Sustainability has played a central role in the results throughout the study. Today, we welcome back Dan Smythe. He is the Vice President of Retail and Hospitality Consulting at EPAM Continuum, and we're going to talk about the final installment of the research. He last joined me in March of 2022. The last round of questions in this study focused on qualitative responses from consumers in the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, in contrast to the quantitative surveying in stages 2 and 3. The 4th report is full of insights, comments both from respondents and experts at EPAM and other organizations. Whether you're a company interested in consumer values or a shopper who wants to understand how to express your environmental commitments to companies, there's something useful for everyone in this report. You can learn more about Dan and EPAM at www.epam.com. Look for the Consumers Unmasked 4 report, which is a free download, and dig into the findings that we'll discuss today. Welcome back to the show, Dan. It's good to have you here. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Mitch. Thanks for having me back.
Well, hey, it's been a year since we talked about the second installment of the EPAM Consumers Unmasked report, and it's been quite a year. We reached 9.1% inflation in June of 2022. It's dropped off a bit, but first off, how are consumers feeling in general?
Well, Mitch, I'd say the good news is consumers are excited, right? People are being a little bit cautious. Getting back to normal, so to speak, coming out of the pandemic. But for the most part, people are feeling positive. You know, we're getting slightly different vibes from the different regions that we had on our panel. But, you know, people in the U.S. are saying they're happy to be making connections again, right? They're ready to swing back into things. In the UK, we're hearing confidence, completely confident, engaging with people in public spaces and returning in person, right? And pretty cheery was kind of the vibe we got. And then in Germany, which is kind of our representative geography in continental Europe, we're hearing, you know, they're feeling like it's normal again. So that's a positive sign that I'm seeing, at least for those of us in retail and consumer products.
Well, you know, if you listen to the Fed or any central bank, it sounds like it's a pretty bad time, but growth is actually quite robust. And there's a strong sense amongst consumers, as I hear and read, that they have cash, that they want to spend it well. They don't just want to spend it, which was sort of a characteristic of the pandemic years. We just spent money.
That's right.
How do consumers value sustainability now, and how's it changed as the economy stumbled a bit?
Well, one thing we're seeing is that consumers still aspire to live sustainably, but they're starting to see, because their wallets are getting a little bit tighter, even though spending is still robust, people are starting to think a little bit more about their spending, getting a little more, you know, price sensitive. And so sustainability has become kind of secondary to price, unfortunately, as we're coming into what may be, or people keep forecasting a recession. We haven't seen it yet, but so that is one of the things that was kind of one of the downsides to what we saw in phase 4 of our research.
Well, you know, the way that they reported that, though, is it wasn't just price. It was rather the kind of the value for the money was more important to them. Is the environmental impact of a product part of that value calculation now, where it might not have been a couple of years ago?
Well, it definitely is. And, you know, not maybe to all consumers, right? They're not a monolith, right? We have we've kind of identified 5 key segments of consumers, but for the most part, sustainability is part of the value equation, but it's never been as high as things like product quality, availability, price. Those were kind of the three big drivers during the pandemic. And what we're seeing now, kind of coming out of the pandemic and coming into maybe potentially a recession, is that price is kind of rising above things like product quality and availability, and kind of that top tier of variables in the equation has always been a little bit higher up than things like brand values and sustainability. So I haven't seen sustainability move up or down in the hierarchy, but what I have seen is some shifting in those things that sit higher up.
Another thing that stood out for me was there's an emphasis amongst the respondents about buying local. It's a very prominent feature of their response to exiting the lockdown. They want to support local businesses and apparently local food. Is that a significant change since the beginning of the pandemic?
I think so, yeah. So we saw a lot of people going to local restaurants, right, and local supermarkets as opposed to the big chains, right? There was a bias toward the independents, and part of that was the sense that these local establishments were giving back to the community, doing things for people locally, right? And so we did see that. We also saw, like, when you talk about travel, people, for some, localization means food, for some it means travel, right? We're seeing more domestic leisure travel, right? Less more ground transport, less air travel. Part of that, though, even as we sort of came out of the concerns about the pandemic, it was really just to avoid the hassle of canceled flights and airport delays, and so that's kind of stuck. And then in terms of just shopping, well, you asked a question about food. I'll go back to that for 1 second. What I haven't seen is a lot of concern about local. When I say local, I didn't see a lot in our respondent data of, I go to the local farmer market, I go straight to the farm. That may have happened. I didn't see it in our data. But what we did see, and maybe one of the unfortunate things about how things changed coming out, is that consumers liked working with or shopping with small businesses in their local area and independents, like I said. But now that they're focusing on price more, they're starting to revert back to large chains, right? And local. And so they're looking they're only going to the local stores for specific things, but they're going to the big chains because they think you get a better price on the total basket. So that's kind of an unfortunate new development I'm seeing coming out of the pandemic.
So, that's interesting. Several things there. In terms of the travel, local travel, I completely buy into the fact that people just want to avoid the airports these days because they've been a mess. But do you anticipate, as, if we can call it, returning to normal travel, international travel in particular, that we're going to see a big rise in that? Or have people sort of come to terms with the fact that that's really the most impactful in terms of carbon emission things they do, and they might want to cut it out?
Yeah, no, sadly, the reasons for avoiding air travel and international travel were more about convenience and hassle and less about environmental impact. I'd like to see people putting that into their equation when they're thinking about where to vacation. But it didn't come up on our panel. And in fact, we're starting to see, kind of not necessarily in our panel, but at a macro level, international travel in leisure travel, air travel is bouncing back with pretty fiercely, just because of pent up demand, despite all the hassles with cancellations and airport delays, which it seemed to have kind of resolved since maybe our survey was administered.
Now, the other thing that people have been looking at is more information about the sustainability of the products or the services they're consuming. And as you just said, with air travel, they don't necessarily acknowledge the impact of flying, but are they starting to pay attention to things like certifications or detailed impact information, or whether or not packaging can be recycled when they're making buying decisions?
Well, it didn't come up specifically in terms of certification. I think partly because that's something we don't have, at least in the US, right? I mean, only a few travel booking sites will show you, like, across your different flight options, which one has more carbon emissions, right? But It's not mainstream yet. And so I think that when consumers think about, at least on our panel, when they think about sustainability, what that means to them, it's pretty broad. It could be eco-friendly products that they believe are eco-friendly. It could be eco-friendly packaging, whether that's the packaging the product comes in when you grab it off the shelf, or whether it's the packaging it comes in when it comes to your door, like whether it's in a plastic envelope versus a cardboard box, right? It could be the delivery options, right? More sustainable. It could be sustainable materials in the product itself. And it could be easily accessible product information. So it could really be any of those things. To call out just some anecdotal examples that came up in our qualitative research, we heard 100% natural being something that's perceived as good for the planet. And that's a signal that people say, oh, that's good, right? We heard things like campaigns to give back to the environment is good. So regardless of whether the product itself is destroying the environment, if the company is giving back financially, that's a good thing. And then, just to cite a couple examples, like H&M, right, which is in a category that gets a lot of flack for, fast fashion gets a lot of flack because people it's basically turning clothing from a durable good into a consumable, which isn't good. But they're embracing sustainable options, right? So that makes an impression on the consumer when they see, oh, okay, they have this even if they don't buy the sustainable option, they might buy the low-priced option that's not sustainable. But just knowing that the company is conscious about it seems to make an impression. But for the most part, our consumers, which are millennials and Gen Z, so they're younger consumers, they say they don't have time to dig into the detail, right? So they just want quick, accessible information. And I almost think it's up to manufacturers or retailers to actually just tell them what they should be looking for, because they don't know, right? So that's my personal impression, right? Is that they don't know because it's just such a broad category, sustainability.
It's not mainstream. It's not mainstream today, as you were saying. But are the leaders, the people, the brands that are doing this kind of communication, explaining a little bit? And I think that's the key idea here. Not too deeply, but a little bit, that they're making environmental efforts. Are they more successful as a result?
Some are and some aren't. And I think that it's an impression that's built up over time. So if I were to cite a few other real world examples, I'll take Patagonia. Patagonia came up quite a bit in our research as a brand that's perceived as sustainable. But when you think about what they've done to achieve that reputation, it's things like the founder giving the company to causes that support the environment. It's things like offering and promoting rewear, right? Selling used clothes, buying back your Patagonia vest and reselling it, things like that. And it's a broad sort of call it kind of a halo that they've created around themselves, I think, to get that. I don't think it's any one thing.
Well, but what you're describing is a number of different tangible things, but at least perceived to be tangible. Like, wow, when I spend money with Patagonia, the profits now go to restoring the planet through charity.
That's right.
But one of the things that did come up throughout the report was a concern about greenwashing. What specific concerns did the panel have about greenwashing, given what you said, that they don't have the time to really dig into the claims?
Yeah, the issue there is they weren't very specific. Just like they said they don't have time to dig into the details. When they say greenwashing, again, I think this is my Dan hypothesis. I don't have data to support this, but I think part of it is an excuse, right? Consumers say, oh, I want to buy sustainably, but I know that some companies out there are greenwashing. I don't know which ones because I don't dive into the details. So I'm just going to dismiss all of it, right? I think in a way it's almost an excuse to say I'm not going to buy this product that says it's more sustainable because I don't know if they're just greenwashing, right? So I think it gets back to the trust issue, right? I think Patagonia has built this trust over years that nobody's worried about the greenwashing, and the H&M example, right? Some people could argue that's great greenwashing to just have a few sustainable items thrown in the assortment just to create an impression. but it seems to me make. So I think this is another one where our consumers aren't a monolith, right? Some are more skeptical and some are more easily convinced. But to answer your question, there was no specific call outs of, oh, this feels like greenwashing.
That's interesting. I mean, our listeners obviously are thinking a lot about this and are at the leading edge of trying to practice these decision making that's good for the planet. It's really it's challenging to hear that they are sort of using it as an excuse too, because there's too much information. I want to talk
wrong about that. That's just my hunch.
Well, I think we're going to find out, but I need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back and continue talking. We're back to talk more with Dan Smythe. He's the Vice President of Retail and Hospitality Consulting at EPAM Continuum. We're discussing the fourth installment of their Consumers Unmasked study. Dan, now, following on what we were just talking about, you've pointed out that price may override ethical considerations, and consumers are not necessarily being diligent about checking the claims that they see on packaging or in advertising. What's your advice to companies about how to make their environmental commitments and progress, how they are making changes, authentically clear to shoppers? Or is that something that isn't what shoppers care about?
Well, I'd say shoppers are looking for an overarching theme across the company's portfolio of products and businesses that says that they are looking to minimize their environmental impact. So once they'll be skeptical if they see some highly promoted examples within the assortment that doesn't resemble the rest of the assortment, for example. I think that to be really authentic, it's important to site specific. So one example that I actually love is, and one of the things we recommend to companies in our report is talk about the durability of your products, right? Because a lot of people don't realize that the best thing you can do for the environment regarding a product is to not buy it or to buy it less often, right? Yeah. And one example I love is Subaru, right? They talk about X percent of Subarus are still on the road today, ever made are still on the road today, right? That sends the signal, right? Because everybody knows that it's not just, at least I hope everybody knows, it's not just the fuel emissions that are bad, but it's the actual manufacture of the car. So it's much better to keep a car for 20 years than it is to buy a new car every 2 years. So things like that, and obviously that applies to clothing as well.
Well, now the report touts the importance of subscription programs across a lot of different product and service categories. That seems to be a potentially interesting way to tie sustainability and extending the life and reuse of products to simple messaging that people can understand. Can these programs reduce our waste generally? I mean, that was an observation in the report. Talk a little about how we can use subscriptions to rejigger our environmental impact.
Well, I think that if we kind of redefine subscriptions a little bit, that could be a big opportunity. In our research, when we saw consumers getting excited about subscriptions, it had more to do with convenience, right? And the most popular and most cited in all four phases of our study is Amazon Prime. And people don't subscribe to Amazon Prime for sustainability reasons. Oh, quite the contrary, right? They like it because it's convenient, free delivery, right? Free, fast delivery, right? It stands for convenience. Anything I want faster and cheaper from Amazon than anywhere else. And I think where I do see hope, though, is when it comes to the potential for synergy between sort of savings, convenience, and subscriptions is the pre-warn model, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I mentioned Patagonia, a lot of companies are getting into this, right? So, one of the things that's bad about fast fashion is we throw it out when we're done with it, right? We buy more. But if we're selling it back and then buying someone else's, right? The hand-me-down is the I always say, if you want to live sustainably, live like my grandmother who never bought anything. It was always, find a neighbor who has an extra and use theirs, right? Freeware, reware is kind of a commercialization of that, if you will. And if you could create some subscription model around reware, Rent the Runway might be an example where multiple people are, so you're not buying a dress, wearing it once, and then putting it in your closet. But renting it and then someone else can wear it. That's a subscription model as an example that could be compelling for both a value, convenience, and sustainability standpoint. Another category. Sorry, you're gonna.
No, go ahead. But what you're describing is packaging reuse, durability, and other concepts into a price that you pay on a regular basis, and that right. could be the simplest way for us to say this is also the way to reduce your impact.
That's right. And one category where we're starting to see new mentions in terms of subscriptions is cosmetics. And when I think about cosmetics, I think a lot about environmental impact. Small things that are in plastic getting shipped around, getting used, getting thrown out, and I know there is a movement toward more sustainable cosmetics and other, maybe keeping the container and refilling it, for example. And I'm seeing more stores pop up that are all about, you bring your own container and you refill it. You buy it once and then you bring back your container and you refill it. And I like that model a lot. I haven't seen it take off yet, but cautiously optimistic that as more people get interested in subscriptions for products that are replenished regularly, like cosmetics, we might start to see some refill models emerge.
Now, this is interesting because what we can do is package the full life cycle of the product and talk about its reusability, its resaleability, its recyclability when somebody's doing their shopping. And you pointed out that consumers want to be more deliberative. Maybe that is a key idea. Do you find that people are interested in whether or not their product can be recycled before they buy it?
Not seeing a lot of that in consumer products. I think that, if you look back, I use the Subaru example, people have always looked at resale value when they buy a car. If it's it's a big ticket item, it's something people look at. I think that I'm not yet seeing that in kind of smaller ticket items like clothing. Although now that the resale market is starting to become more liquid, I think it is becoming more, it might start to become, I don't want to go too far, right?
Okay.
It might, so I'll give an example of just anecdotal example from my own life. My wife and one of her best friends, I'll call it they collect handbags. And there were some that my wife's friend wasn't using, and her son offered to resell them for her and keep a percentage of the proceeds. And she said, "Sure, it's no skin off my back. I'm not using it anyway." Now, will that eventually lead to people like her thinking when they buy a bag, "Oh, my son can sell this for me when I'm done with it. I'll be more likely to buy it if it has a high resale value." I think that could start to play out. And then it'll just kind of cascade down into smaller ticket items.
An interesting trend. I was interested to see too that you recommended creating recycling incentive programs to communicate a commitment to sustainability. Based on the research that you've done, what do you think a meaningful incentive is, say as a percentage of the purchase price, to increase our recovery rate?
Yeah, we didn't test that in our research per se, but I have I can speak to some examples that, and my gut says a couple things. One is it's got to be probably more than 10%. So, right, take bottles and cans, for example. There's been an incentive to recycle those for a long time, but I can't think of a single person who actually collects the deposit. Right, people might put them in the recycle bin now that that's become a habit, but very few people would actually save their bottles and bring them back for the deposit, right? So that 5 cents is, not enough. However, if you look at ink cartridges and office supply stores, as an example, $2 an ink cartridge, if you paid, $17 for the ink cartridge and you get $2 to recycle it, probably going to bring it back. But I think what's more relevant than the percentage of the product price is the cost, the absolute value relative to the effort required to actually get it back to it. Because if you think mentally about, oh, if I return this can, I'm going to get 5 cents back. If I return this ink cartridge, I'm going to get $2. Well, it's the same amount of effort, whether it's a can or an ink cartridge, right? You're taking it back to a store. So I think that the effort and value trade-off is probably going to be more relevant in the consumer's mind than the percentage of the purchase price.
Now, another aspect of the fast fashion conversation relates to how wasteful returns are. Do you find that people are starting to become concerned about their e-commerce returns, which sometimes run as high as 40%?
Yeah, not yet. I would say e-commerce retailers are very concerned about it because it affects their costs.
Right.
But consumers, because they're not paying for it, actually, if anything, the data we saw in returns is that easy, free returns is a selling point. So they're not thinking about returns as a bad thing. They're thinking about the ability to return. They're not thinking about the environmental impact of sending that product back, unfortunately. And so I think it may take some time. Maybe that's an opportunity for retailers to reduce their returns by, making the impact more visible to consumers, so they think twice about returning their product.
Well, I also think things like better fitting technology and so forth can reduce that waste because we just don't need to return it. But there's a story there that I don't think people have really taken advantage of as we talk about how do we all start to create less waste.
Absolutely.
Now, you talked about the fact that sustainable options aren't always more expensive anymore. Do you see concerns about a green premium, the extra cost of being sustainable, beginning to fade as more products are being made sustainably and or economies of scale are starting to develop?
I'm not worried about that. I think that I'll go to an example of something else that has a premium and has now become more widely available and has more economies of scale, and that's convenience. One of the things we learned is that shoppers, even though they're stretched for money and they say that they're not willing to trade off sustainability for cost, they will pay for convenience. We're hearing that loud and clear. Consumers would rather pay a premium for delivery. They'd rather pay for delivery than to maximize convenience than have to go to a store, right? If they find going to a store to be inconvenient. People love to order from DoorDash, Instacart, Uber Eats, and they're willing to pay the fee to get groceries and food delivered to the doorstep. So if consumers want something like they do convenience, they're willing to pay for it. And that's become more widely available, and there's more economies of scale now that delivery routes are getting denser and all that. But the willingness, I think it's all about willingness to pay. It's less about the cost side of the economics equation for price premiums. And so I think that to really the biggest thing standing in the way of the sustainability premium is the desire. People need to want it, and if they want it, they'll pay for it under any condition. And so,
taking delivery as an example, if you said, for instance, pay an extra $1 and we'll deliver with an EV or something like that, is that a promise that people would respond to at this point?
Some will. In fact, it even came up with one of our surveys. We did hear reference to a very specific delivery service that always uses the greenest option, and that people are very loyal to that provider because they know that. So that may be less a matter of I'm going to choose the greener option when I order from Amazon. It may be more of I'm going to order from this other company that's not Amazon because I know they always use the greener option. So that's something that I'm kind of watching, and I want to see how that plays out, because I did like to hear that was something that will drive loyalty, right?
Shoppers are becoming more deliberative. Do you think that, and recognizing that they're not all valuing sustainability the same way, do you think that leaning into sustainability is the right way for brands who want to establish an early relationship with millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, who is now 11 years old? they're clearly going to be more oriented around environmental responsibility. Is that a good investment in building a future market rather than addressing today's existing market?
I think it's something that shouldn't be overlooked. I think that when we looked at what kind of triggers an impulse purchase, for example,
sure,
it was more about that, especially in a recessionary time, which we're not in yet, but as we're potentially getting there. It's all about that sort of little treat, right? That little impulse purchase that's going to give you that emotional uplift. And lipstick is an example, right? The lipstick effect that, it's something that doesn't cost a lot, but it might make me feel better. And so I'm going to splurge, right? If we can find a way for a sustainable option to provide that emotional uplift, that indulgence, that little treat experience, then it's possible. And that's something I think might be worth exploring further as we get into our future research.
Well, tell us what you're going to do now. I mean, you finished Consumers Unmasked. It was a 4-survey sequence. What are you going to continue to do to track the evolution of this conscious shopper that we're talking about?
Well, we haven't. I can't speak to any specific research, but as I think about some of the things that probably warrant further investigation from our findings would be, you mentioned the conscious consumer. We did segment shoppers into 5 categories. What we haven't done yet, it might be a good opportunity for the future, is to really dive deeply into each of those and see how the survey results differ. For example, or if I look at the conscious consumer, how do they value sustainability versus price versus convenience, for example, and how is that changing over time? And also, what's the relative size of these different segments, right? So are more people becoming conscious consumers and fewer people are being frivolous spenders, right? So I think kind of double clicking into each of those 5 segments would be a nice follow-on to the study.
Well, I look forward to reading that. That would be great. I'd particularly like to know whether or not the conscious consumer represents a growing and eventually dominant share of the market. But Dan, when you have that, we look forward to talking again.
Well, check out epam.com/insights to stay on top of our latest thinking.
Thanks very much for spending time with us today, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Mitch.
We've been speaking with EPAM Continuum's Vice President of Retail and Hospitality Consulting, Dan Smythe, about the 4th and final installment of their Consumers Unmasked report, which you can find by visiting epam.com and searching for Consumers Unmasked 4. So, what did we learn today? The long, slow buildup of sustainability-related concerns among shoppers got a boost from the pandemic. When we sat at home with time on our hands, a lot of people turned their attention to questions about the structure of our economy and its environmental impact. EPAM surveys focused on the ideas that drive consumer decisions, while other research, such as from Deloitte and McKinsey, showed that sustainable shopping was more resilient than other categories, staying stronger as inflation took hold than, for example, deciding what to buy on price. But as Dan said, price is critical. Price and convenience define most of our shopping decisions. Translating the sustainability benefits of more mundane changes in a product, such as emphasizing its durability or its resale value or the impact of delivering it to the home, will be important to helping people set values about their conscious shopping decisions. I'd be curious to hear from you about what factors you're looking at when considering a purchase. Drop me a line at mitch@earth911.com to share your ideas. I've got questions. Do decisions such as Amazon's investment in electric delivery vans, for example, matter to you? Are you making fewer purchases of things that last longer? Or have you expressed your desire to buy sustainable products to a company or at a retail store? As we exit this pandemic era, everyone faces new choices, and we'll be following research from many organizations to understand how people's preferences are reflected in the products and packaging that they're buying. And you all can help by sharing this podcast and the more than 380 interviews on sustainability in your ear. I hope you'll take a moment to write a review of the podcast. That really gets more attention and helps get the word out. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas to create less waste. Tell your friends, family, coworkers, people on the street that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness you choose to frequent. Thank you very much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.